Jacob, an orphan boy, has had to face many hardships in life. His mother passed away when he was very young, and his father disappeared without a trace, leaving him to live with his elderly grandmother. However, now Jacob's grandmother is seriously ill and requires a large sum of money for treatment, leaving Jacob with no choice but to sing to earn money to save her. But when the boy begins to sing, the unexpected happens. A woman appears, someone who will completely change Jacob's life. This woman brings Jacob a life-changing secret, a truth that he may never have dared to believe. What is this shocking secret? Let's explore this surprising and touching story right now. Jacob, a 14-year-old boy from Evanston, grew up under the care and love of his grandmother, Helen. She was a strong and thoughtful woman who, despite the difficulties in her life, always made sure Jacob felt loved. However, there was one part of Jacob's life that was always shrouded in mystery: his parents. Whenever Jacob asked about them, Helen would gently respond that his mother had passed away when he was just a child, and his father had left the city without a trace. Although this mystery haunted him, the love and warmth from his grandmother filled most of the void. However, life took a sudden turn when Helen fell seriously ill. Her health deteriorated rapidly, and it was clear that she needed an expensive surgery that Jacob could not afford. With no other family to turn to, Jacob was placed in an orphanage, a place with long, silent corridors that seemed to echo the anxiety in his heart. For a 14-year-old boy, the weight of responsibility was overwhelming. He knew that he had to save the only person who had always been by his side. However, Jacob was still too young to find a stable job that could earn him money. He knew he had to do something to help his grandmother, but he didn't know where to start. After many nights of thinking, Jacob decided to choose a job that was linked to his talent, his voice. Every evening, he would secretly leave the orphanage, where he lived with other children, and head to small lounges in the city, hoping to find an opportunity to showcase his talent. He had been practicing singing since he was very young, and he always dreamed of one day standing on stage, singing for others, and earning money to support his grandmother. However, because he was still too young and an orphan, every time he went to these lounges and asked to sing, he was turned away. The managers and owners would shake their heads, and some even appeared annoyed, saying that a child like him couldn't do this job. "You're too young to be on stage. You need to learn and grow first," one manager said coldly as he rejected Jacob. After many days of searching for work without any results, Jacob felt exhausted and defeated. He sat down on the sidewalk, his hands holding his head, his eyes staring blankly at the ground, as if he had no more strength to continue. He could feel the heaviness in his heart as he watched happy families walking together down the busy street, fathers and mothers holding hands, laughing and chatting with their children. It only made him feel more lost and alone. He looked at them, thinking of his grandmother, the only person left by his side, a kind elderly woman who had always loved and cared for him. But now, she was suffering from a serious illness, and Jacob knew that without money for treatment, she would soon leave him, just like all the other loved ones in his life. He was alone, with no one else. Anxiety swelled within the boy, dark thoughts of a future with no way out. If his grandmother didn't survive, he wouldn't know where to turn. The happy families around him, he could only watch them from afar, longing for a life like that, but reality felt so far out of reach. As night fell, Jacob remained seated, the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk, but their light couldn't dispel the darkness in his heart. The struggles and challenges seemed endless, and the boy could only sit there, alone, amidst the bustling crowd, feeling lonelier than ever. At that moment, a man in a smart suit with a serious expression approached. He sat down next to Jacob, looked at him for a while, and then spoke, asking for his name and family background. Jacob was a bit surprised by the stranger's concern, but he decided to share his story. He explained that he was doing this to raise money for his grandmother's treatment, and also revealed his singing talent, though he wasn't sure where to find a job. The man looked at him, smiled, and said, "I own a large lounge. If you'd like, you can come there and sing for an audition this weekend." Jacob was both surprised and incredibly happy. "Thank you, sir. I'll be there." The weekend arrived, and Jacob could hardly imagine that the lounge where he would perform for the first time was so vast and luxurious. Jacob stood at the door, feeling incredibly small in the grand space. He wore an old, patched-up shirt, faded jeans, and worn-out leather shoes. His messy hair couldn't hide the poverty he carried with him. He stood there, silently gazing into the lounge, where everyone was dressed neatly and formally. As he entered, all eyes immediately turned toward Jacob. The patrons seated nearby looked at him with disapproval, some furrowing their brows, clearly displeased by the appearance of a boy dressed in ragged clothes. A few scornful glances passed over him, and there were murmurs about why a child like him was allowed to step onto the stage. "Look at this kid, why would they let him on stage?" A man seated nearby spoke up, his voice full of mockery. "He's probably just here to cause trouble. I wonder if he came here just to make a fool of himself," a woman murmured, causing those around her to laugh derisively. Jacob stood still, his palms drenched in sweat. He lowered his head, trying to suppress the feeling of embarrassment rising within him. But then, a deep voice from behind broke the silence, causing the room to quiet immediately. "Let him sing." The man in the suit from the previous day who had helped him spoke up. He looked at everyone in the room with a sharp gaze. "This is his chance. If you want to hear a real voice, let the boy perform." The atmosphere became tense as everyone fell silent. Jacob felt all eyes on him, his heart racing as though it would jump out of his chest. He walked up to the stage, stood before the microphone, but said nothing, just staring down at the cold faces. He took a deep breath and gently began to sing. Jacob's voice filled the room, brimming with emotion. Each note, each line of the song carried the deep sorrow of an orphaned child, the hopes and dreams that had never been voiced. His voice, though still immature, was full of strength, making the space feel like it had slowed down. Immediately, the room became quiet, all eyes fixed on Jacob. Those who had previously criticized him now couldn't take their eyes off him. A few people were drawn into the music, and tears unexpectedly fell on the hardened faces. When the song ended, a deep silence filled the air. Finally, a man sitting near the door, holding a glass of wine, was the first to clap, and gradually the whole room joined in. Jacob looked around, his eyes sparkling. A tear that he couldn't hold back rolled down his cheek. "You did very well," the man in the suit smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "Today you've shown everyone that it's not the appearance, but the heart that truly defines greatness." After the performance, the owner of the cafe gave Jacob a generous amount of money and encouraged him, saying, "Come again next week, I'll give you another chance." From then on, every weekend the cafe became more crowded. The boys' singing brought a fresh atmosphere and attracted listeners, which made the owner happy. As for Jacob, thanks to this, not only did he earn more money, but he also received encouragement, giving him renewed hope for his grandmother's surgery. One day, while Jacob was singing at the cafe, a woman sitting in a dark corner suddenly became frantic upon hearing his voice. When Jacob began singing, memories flooded back to her, and she suddenly screamed, "Dominic!" before collapsing right there. The people around rushed to help, and when she regained consciousness, her eyes were filled with confusion and pain. She looked at Jacob with astonishment and asked him about his father. Jacob, though surprised, answered that he knew nothing about the father who had abandoned him when he was a child. The woman couldn't contain her emotions and shared that she had once deeply loved his father, and hearing this voice again made her unable to believe it. She then said she would help the boy find his father, but Jacob was still hesitant. He didn't know whether he should search for the man who had abandoned him all these years. He decided that the next day he would go to the hospital to ask his grandmother. The morning felt urgent. Jacob knew he had to meet his grandmother and ask her the truth about his parents. He hurriedly dressed and went to the hospital, his heart pounding with excitement and worry. Upon arriving, Jacob entered his grandmother's hospital room, where the soft beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound. She lay in bed, her face once radiant, now pale and tired. But when she saw Jacob, a faint smile appeared on her face. "Hello, Jacob," she said, her voice weak but warm. "You look like you have something you want to say." Jacob sat down beside the bed, his eyes filled with determination but also tinged with fear. He looked at his grandmother for a moment, then spoke. "Grandma, I want to know about my parents. Why did they leave me? Why do I have to live alone?" His voice trembled, as if all the questions he'd been holding inside for so long suddenly poured out uncontrollably. Grandma Helen looked at him with eyes full of sympathy and regret. "Jacob, you have the right to know," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. Your parents, they had their reasons, but the truth about them is not simple. You need to understand that things happened, and life is not always easy. Jacob stared at her, waiting for each explanation. The anxiety grew even stronger, but there was also a flicker of hope that he might uncover the truth about his family. Grandma Helen fell silent for a moment, as if trying to organize her thoughts before she spoke again. I knew this day would come, she said gently. You deserve to know the truth. Jacob held his breath, his heart pounding as Helen began to recount her story. Your father, Dominic, was a good man. Your father loved you more than anything. But there were things that happened in his life. He had dangerous enemies, people who wanted to harm him. And he thought the only way to protect you was to leave. So one night your father left. He didn't tell me where he was going, only that I had to keep you safe. I don't know if I will ever see your father again, and I didn't want you to live with that pain, so I never mentioned your father's name to you. I thought it would be better that way. Jacob felt dazed as he listened to her words. His father had left to protect him, a concept that was hard to understand. Then why didn't you ever tell me this before? Jacob asked, his voice almost a whisper. Helen's eyes filled with tears. Because I didn't want you to grow up hating your father. I didn't want you to carry that burden. I thought it would be better if you didn't know. Jacob leaned back, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions inside him. He had spent his whole life wondering about his father, and now the truth had finally been revealed. But instead of feeling at peace, it only left him with more questions. Did Dad ever try to come back? Jacob asked, his voice trembling. Helen shook her head. No, I never heard anything about your father again. I don't know what happened to him, but I always believed he did what he thought was best for you. Tears began to well up in Jacob's eyes as he tried to come to terms with his father's decisions. He had always dreamed of meeting the man who had abandoned him, but now, he wasn't sure how he was supposed to feel. Jacob looked at her with an emotional gaze, then softly said, Grandma, I sang at a big cafe last weekend. There, I met a woman named Naomi. She said my voice sounded familiar, like she'd heard it somewhere before. After I finished singing, she rushed up and shouted my name, Dominic. She said she'd help me find my dad. I thought maybe you could help me understand this better. Helen remained silent for a moment, her eyes seemingly gazing through the years past, as though she were rewinding time to relive ancient memories. She sighed softly, then gently tucked a few stray silver hairs from Jacob's forehead. Do whatever you feel is right, Jacob, she said, her voice gentle but profound. You don't have to carry the burden of the past, nor do you need to hold onto old secrets. If you want to find your father, then go. Go and live the life you deserve. Before Jacob could sigh from the mixed emotions swelling within him, she continued, that woman, Naomi, she came to see me. She made it very clear that she would help you find your father. She said that you are the son of the man she has loved all these years. Since your father left, I've always believed that he did everything he could to protect you, but I never knew where he went. And now, that woman, she will help you find everything, help you find your father. Jacob listened intently to every word she spoke, a profound feeling rising within him. He was no longer the child who buried himself in loneliness. Now he could open his heart to embrace hope. This new and unfamiliar sensation made his heart race. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he truly felt that he was not alone. After the conversation with her ended, Jacob felt as if a new door had just opened in his life. Naomi, with her determination and persistence, had never hesitated. She had sought out every lead, unafraid to assist Jacob and his grandmother. With the help of a renowned detective, Naomi had obtained an address, a trace of the man she had once loved but couldn't be with, Jacob's father. The drive to the small town was filled with a heavy silence. Jacob sat still, his gaze fixed on the window, his mind filled with unanswered questions. When they arrived at the small house, weeds grew around it, the paint on the door was peeling, and everything looked old and ordinary. Jacob stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. Here we are, Naomi said softly. Are you ready? Jacob only nodded, but inside he was filled with conflicting emotions. The two of them walked up to the doorstep. Jacob raised his hand and knocked on the door. The soft knocks echoed in the quiet street. A moment later, the door creaked open, and before them stood Dominic. The man had aged. his face marked with the traces of hard years. But it was unmistakable this was Dominic, Jacob's father. Father, Jacob whispered, but couldn't say another word. The two stood there, staring at each other, not knowing where to begin. Naomi stood a step behind, her heart tightening as she witnessed this moment. Finally, Dominic spoke, his voice hoarse. You look so much like your mother," he said, his eyes sad and full of regret. Jacob stared into his father's eyes, unable to control the mix of anger and sorrow that surged within him. "Why did you leave me? Why didn't you come back for me?" Dominic lowered his head, his voice choking. "I thought I was doing what was best for you. I didn't know what to do to protect you. By the time I realized it was too late." Jacob stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You should have tried. You can't just leave like that." His voice cracked with pain. "She's dying, and I don't know if she's going to survive." Dominic's eyes were red, and he took a step toward Jacob, wanting to offer comfort. But Jacob stepped back, unwilling to accept it. "I'm sorry, son. I'm a coward and I was wrong. If you'll allow me, I want to try again. I want to be your father now." Jacob stood there, struggling with his conflicting emotions. He wanted to be angry, to blame, but his heart couldn't stop yearning for a father. Finally, after a moment of silence, Jacob looked at Dominic and sighed. "Okay, we'll try, but it's probably going to take some time." Dominic nodded, his eyes filled with hope and sadness. "I'll wait, no matter how long it takes." Then, Dominic turned to Naomi, his gaze full of regret. "I'm sorry, Naomi," he said, his voice deep. "I left without a word, without telling you why. I thought leaving would protect you, but I was wrong." Naomi was silent for a while, then finally spoke, her voice gentle yet full of forgiveness. "If you thought that, I can't blame you. I just wanted to know why, and now I understand." Dominic lowered his head, feeling the pain he had caused her. "I'll try to make it right, Naomi," he whispered. "I won't lose you again." After the meeting, Dominic, Jacob, and Naomi went to the hospital. Walking slowly down the quiet hallway, their hearts were heavy with worry and emotion. When they reached the hospital room, Dominic paused for a moment and looked at Naomi with sincere eyes. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said, his voice hoarse. Naomi smiled softly, but in her eyes, there was comfort and hope. "You deserve to meet your mother, Dominic," she said gently. Dominic knocked on the door, and a weak voice from inside responded, "Come in." The door opened, and in the dim light of the hospital room, Mrs. Helen was lying on the bed. When she saw Dominic standing there, her eyes widened in surprise, and tears began to fall. She weakly sat up, reaching out as if to touch him. "Dominic, you finally come back." Her voice was choked with emotion. Dominic didn't say anything. He just walked to her bedside, sat down, and took her hand. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. It's been so long," he choked, his voice breaking. Naomi stood outside the room, witnessing the scene and feeling the weight of all the years of separation. Mrs. Helen gripped Dominic's hand tightly, looked into his eyes, and softly said, "You've done well, my son. I know you've had to endure a lot. But don't worry now that you're here." The three of them stood there in silence, with only the soft sounds of breathing and the heartbeat of those who had been apart for so long, now reunited in their final moments together. After all the trials and hardships, Jacob had finally found his long-lost father, and his small family had the chance to reunite. Mrs. Helen was operated on in time, and her health gradually stabilized. Thanks to Naomi's devoted help, Dominic found stable work and rented a small, cozy house to begin a new life. Jacob now not only had his grandmother but also his father by his side, a complete family that he had always dreamed of. Naomi, though not living with them, remained a close friend, frequently visiting and sharing in their joy. Every time they gathered, the family would come together, chatting happily, and the sounds of warm laughter would fill the small house. They had found happiness with each other and continued to write the beautiful days ahead.